it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. Earlier this month I had a request to make the twin star 12.5-inch block. I've made friendship stars, which is, if you look at one of the colors, the red or the purple, that's basically a friendship star, but I have never made the one where the double. What the spot that can cause a lot of the problems is these are called quarter square triangles. The red part, and if this were all white, is the half square triangle, and then when you put this in, it's a quarter square triangle. If you had this piece here and the same thing here, just purple and white, then you'd be making an hourglass block. So yesterday I sat down and I started making some of these blocks. I'll put a link down below to the blog post that I followed. And there are a couple spots that are a little bit tricky. I looked up at several different tutorials on these. They tend to leave out some of the small little details. I looked at several different blog posts for tutorials for this block, and they are a little bit tricky when it comes to this quarter square triangle up here. It seems like they don't give you all the exact information you need, so you have to read several different tutorials to figure out all the little parts to get it right. And let me tell you, it is real easy to get this block mixed up. So this is one of the versions I made. This is actually block number 3, because yes, it did take me 3 blocks to get it correct. An alternate version is you can have a solid block in the center, and you see how much this changes the way the block looks. Here's the one with this. This reminds me of like flags on a ship, on a boat, like a sailing boat, with the solid center. But of course I love color, so I really like this. And you can alternate. The one we're going to make today, this is what I'm considering a red block because the center is red. As I was cutting out the fabrics, I made enough to make another block for today and sew along with you. And we're going to do a purple center, and we'll see how that looks compared to this one. Now this is the first block that I made a couple times. As you can see, these stars right here, it's not swirling. Everything's a little bit confused. When I actually sewed it together, I had turned these 2 blocks so that they were this way, because I wasn't paying attention to make sure all my background fabrics were along the outside. And as we're sewing it, I'll show you how this is where I messed these up on these quarter square triangles so that I don't have that full rotation of the block like it's supposed to. So today we're going to make the opposite of this one. We're going to make a 12.5 unfinished block, and I'll show you how it goes together. From my background fabrics, I cut out 4 4.5-inch squares. These are going to be in the 4 corners. I'm using a color in the center, but if you wanted to use the background color in the center, you would go ahead and cut out an additional 4.5-inch square, so you'd have a total of 5. Now for this one, I've chose purple for my center. So this one is also cut at 4.5 inches. So you're going to have 5 of your blocks that are going to be solid, and we're not going to touch these. For my background fabric, I'm also going to cut a 5.25-inch square. And I'm also going to cut a 5.25-inch from the same fabric that I used for the center of my block. And then as you can see, I'm going to cut it on the diagonally this way and a diagonal this way. And these are going to be the points of my star going around. The way we're cutting these, you're going to have some bias edges, so it's always a good idea to starch these and then handle them as very little as you need. Now for my second color, I'm going to cut 2 squares, 1, 2, and I'm going to cut this. The pattern, some of the patterns say 5 inches and some of them say 4 7/8. When you're cutting something 4 7/8, then you're going to have a perfect seam allowance, and you're not going to have much wiggle room to trim them down. So I go ahead and cut mine a little bit larger, and I go for the 5-inch square. And then on both of them, you're going to cut them just once diagonally. And this is going to be your secondary star petals that go around. Now we're going to be sewing these together into your quarter square triangles. Now this is where it got really confusing. And when I put up the link to the blog post that I used, there's a little picture that you scroll down to, and it shows you how to lay these out. So what you want to make sure is you have everything laid out exactly the same, so that all your pieces are going in the same direction. So what you're doing is you're kind of getting an arrow this way. You're having both angles going in like this. So all your straight edges are also going in the same direction. This is where I found it really confusing because I couldn't figure out exactly how to sew these pieces together to make sure they went in properly. I've made several hourglass blocks and it's really easy. You just lay two pieces of fabric together and you stitch it in two different directions and you get your blocks. This one was a little bit harder. So line everything up and make sure that they're all going in the same direction and you have all these arrow points going like this. I'm not normally much of a pinner, but I definitely want to use pins here just so that when I go from here to the sewing machine, I don't get confused and lost and not know exactly where I'm sewing. So this is going to be our stitch line. So I'm just going to lay these down, line them up, and I'd probably put 2 pins in. What I noticed a problem with stitching these is you want to make sure you start at this right angle here and stitch down this line. But as you're stitching, you have to be careful because this piece wants to wobble. So either hold it with maybe a stiletto or hold it with the pin. And when I get about halfway or a little 3/4, I slow down my stitching. I'm normally a speed demon and I like to go super fast. But here, if you go super fast, you're going to go like this and you're going to end up stitching a smaller seam allowance. So we're going to stitch right down here and we're going to go nice and slow and make sure everything stays nice and even. Putting pins in them this way also allows me to remember exactly where I'm going. Now remember, be careful because this is a bias edge and we don't want to really be pulling on it. Now as you can see here, I have all of the background fabrics on the top. You don't want to get these mixed up because this block, this is where I'd put half of them on top and half of them on the bottom. And this is where you end up getting those goofy little pieces and things don't line up just right. You're not getting that nice swirl of your star. See how you have the purple this way and the red this way? Now if this is the block you want to use, it's perfectly fine. But the point of this block is to have the double stars so it swirls around. This is the way one of the blog posts suggests to make sure you always have all the background on the top. I did not test it out to see how it would look with all of your main color on the top. After I'd already messed up one block, I thought that was plenty. I didn't have as much red fabric as I'd hoped, and I didn't want to make another problem. So I'm going to go take these over to the machine. I'm going to stitch it with just probably a little bit of a scant 1/4 inch to make sure that our block turns out at 12.5 inches, and then I'll be right back. Here they are, all stitched together and pressed. I went ahead and I pressed to the dark side because you don't want to have that dark fabric shadowing through on the white. So there's our 4 square triangles, and our next step would be to take from our square that we cut in half, and we're going to stitch each of our triangles to here. Now the one tip I have here is if you didn't quite get your 1/4 inch just right here, and maybe you have it a little bit wider, what you want to do is if you fold this square in half, and just gently do a little finger press here, because remember, once again we're dealing with bias and stuff and we don't want to stretch it out, just to find the halfway mark. Then you can take this piece and where your seam is, just line that up on your halfway mark. So if you're just off a little bit, if your triangles are just a little bit shorter, you can go ahead and just make sure you spread that out a little bit. Now since you are working on bias, if you're off just a smidgen as you're stitching and you had to just stretch just gently, just a little, but you don't want to do anything more than like a 1/16 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch possibly at the most. But mine worked out really well. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to stitch along this side. You can go ahead and put pins in it again to help you avoid stretching out this bias too much. So I'm going to pick these up. I'm going to go sew these together and I'll be right back. There's my pieces all done. And with these, I went ahead and I pressed to the full size triangle because you got less seams that way and it's going to lay flatter. Remember, make sure if you're using steam and stuff that you're not dragging your iron, that you're just pressing, because with all the bias seams, you can easily stretch that out. Now our next step is to trim these up, and since our background squares and our center were all at 4.5 inches, we need to trim these up to 4.5 inches. Now we're going to trim these up just like you would any basic half square triangle. You have that center line that you're going to line up with the center line on your little 6.5 or such ruler. And you just line it up on that center line. We're going for 4.5 inches, so I need to make sure that wherever my 4.5 inch line is, that I have fabric all around on the sides. And I can slide it, my ruler, this way on my block to make sure I'm getting enough fabric. I like to have my one solid piece up to the top. For some reason, trimming off this section first makes it easier to make sure my blocks are at a true 4.5. When I turn it the other way, I don't know why. Same thing with the half square triangles. It just works better for me this way. So I have my full triangle up at this half. And my quarter square triangle there. I have everything lined up. And then I'm just going to trim around the side. Now I do recommend, as you're working on these blocks, to make sure you put a new needle into your sewing machine, because when you're stitching these two together and you're going through your machine, this corner of course likes to get sucked down into the machine. So I recommend either using leaders and enders to start out, or that little scrap piece of fabric you sew over first, to try to help avoid this triangle, the tip of it, getting sucked into your machine. And I noticed my needle is starting to get a little dull, so I'm going to have to change that out, because a nice sharp needle will allow you to stitch along this side a lot easier. So then we trimmed those two sides, and we'll just turn it around and do the same thing. Line it up at 4.5 inches on both sides here. Make sure we're down our center. And there you are, your piece is all set. I'm going to go ahead and trim up the rest of these, and we'll show you how the block goes together. Here you can see all 4 of these pieces all trimmed up and ready to go into our block. If you notice, they are all the same. All the red is to the left and all the purple is to the bottom right. They kind of look like tulips to me. Like right here is the petals of the tulip, and then, you know, there's your background. So just make sure when you get to this point, there's no sense going any further if they're not all identical. Because trust me, if they don't all look the same, your star is not going to come out right. I learned that already on my first block. This block is basically, when it's all said and done, is just a 9 patch. So once we get to this point, the rest of it's really easy. You just need to make sure your background is always facing the outside of your block. And since all these pieces are made the same, they're all going to set in there perfectly, and you're not going to have to worry about it, as long as you don't get a little crazy and do this. Because that's how I messed up my first block. So if you keep them this way, make sure all of your colors, all your backgrounds are pointing outside, and you have a full coverage color edge touching the inside. Now I'm going to stitch them together like I would a 9 patch. For me, I stitch these 2 columns together, and then I add this 3rd column to it, and then I go ahead and I sew those into the rows. So let me go ahead and stitch this all together, and we'll see what it looks like as a finished block and make sure I got it right. Before I go sew this block together, I just want to let you know, when I was stitching these 2 together, I made sure I put my solid triangle on the bottom, because your feed dogs, if this piece is a little bit bigger than your piece quarter square triangles here, your feed dogs will take a little bit of that extra fabric and kind of, not necessarily gather it in, but it tends to eat it up a little bit. And then this way your 2 pieces will be perfect together. Because sometimes it's just a smidgen longer with the red, and it just worked out really nice to have the full solid triangle on the bottom for those feed dogs to grab it. Now, of course, if your machine has the even feed feature, you're not going to have to worry about that. Or if you're using a walk-in foot, then your top and your bottom are going to move at the same speed, and you also won't have that problem. And there's our finished block. I think these come out really nice. Mine actually, even with all my little bit of issues with 1/4 inch seams and stuff, mine's coming out almost spot on. I just have a little bit I had to trim over here to a 12.5 inch block. Now, if you were only making a quilt full of these blocks, whatever your sewing machine gives you, if this comes out as 12 inches instead of 12 and a half, or 12 and a quarter, whatever yours comes out to, if you're doing an entire quilt of these, then it'll be fine because they'll all match. If you're doing a whole bunch of 12 and a half inch squares together, then you want to make sure you check your 1/4 inch seam allowance, maybe go a little scant. Guess I missed a little spot pressing here, but a lot of these seams, if you prefer where they meet up, especially these two that come down this way, it could be a good idea to go ahead and press these open because there is quite a bit of bulk that comes right here in this seam. I could try pressing them this way, but then I'm still just going to have a bunch of bulk in this section. So either way. So if you want to go ahead and press these open, it'll work in that spot. But for the most part, I was able to just go ahead and press to one side or the other. And there's that square. So this is what the two of them look like when you put them together based on how you change up your colors. And my table's not big enough for us to get a total view of all of them, but you could go ahead and alternate and have a solid center and a colored center and just make a different type of checkerboard in your quilt block. Change up all your colors, make them all the same. Okay, so I got really curious and I decided to go ahead and instead of, when I was making my 1/4 square triangles, instead of putting the background fabric on top of the colored piece, I went ahead and I put the colored piece on top of the background. And as you can see, I don't think it really makes any difference at all. They're basically, if I remember my geometry right, they're all equilateral triangles. So no matter how you stitch them, it's going to be the same. It's still the two pieces together when you open them up. It's still background and colored all the way around. As you can see, this looks really good, and I wanted to say similar to purple, so I went with the blue and a red. Now this one, I think I stitched this one a little too fast. I'm going to have to take out the seam ripper because my seams don't match up here, nor do they match up here. And if I were to stitch this, I would go ahead and lose my point right here because I didn't get it all the way out to the edge. But that's okay, this was just a practice piece and it'll be fine. I'll go ahead and take out the seam ripper to it and fix it up before I do anything with it. And one of the things I wanted to say though is this center piece that you started at, I believe it's the 4.5 inches still. You can make any type of 4.5 inch block you want to put in there. You could put a pinwheel, you could put a square and square. What would be fun, since this is basically a friendship star, you could go ahead and put a 4.5 inch friendship star inside here, using the same color family or using a different one. So I hope that helped everyone out. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below. And everyone's been very, very helpful down in the comments. So if anyone knows the answer to your question, I'm sure they'll jump right in. And if it's something I need to make a new little addendum to this video for, I'll go ahead and do that. Overall, this block, I would call it, I think a beginner could do it. You just have to take your time and go slow. I don't think you really need to be any type of an advanced quilter to do this. It has the basic principles. Make sure your fabric you're going careful with your bias pieces. Make sure everything's cut properly. You have the right 1/4 inch seam, and that you're pressing it and not ironing and rubbing your fabric so it comes out of shape. So I think this would make a really good fun quilt with all the same blocks. But I think it'd also make, if you chose your fabrics based on your living room or your bedroom, this would make a really nice pillow cover also for a throw pillow. Well, that's it for me this week. I will see you next time I see you. Happy crafting and enjoy yourself. Bye.